I've called this section arguments and why they fail, but of course you wouldn't use that language. You'd say why I'm not convinced, or you know.
Yeah.
So arguments why they fail. Metaphysical / cosmological arguments. Why don't you think they're sufficient for God?
So there are many different cosmological arguments. We could talk about the Kalam cosmological argument, or we could talk about Aquinas' second way, or we could talk about a kind of Leibnizian argument from contingency, and there are others. So, I mean, I'll give you an example. So we'll go Kalam cosmological argument. So whatever begins to exist has a cause of its beginning to exist. The universe began to exist, so there's a cause of the beginning to exist of the universe. There's a cause of the universe that's coming into existence. And, I mean, I'll leave out further steps. That cause is God. But plausibly, if there's a cause of the universe, you might think it's going to turn out to be God. There are naturalistic stories you can tell on which that's not the case. But, right, anyway. So that's the argument. What's wrong with that particular argument? Well, let's go with what's wrong with the cosmological arguments, the kind of metaphysical cosmological arguments generally, is that there's a gap between the conclusion that you get to, there's a cause of the existence of the universe, and that being is God. And that gap always turns out to be really hard to fill in. Right? So imagine, in this particular case, that there's a multiverse and it's infinite in the past, and every now and then a kind of bubble nucleates in the multiverse and becomes a universe. And there's something in the multiverse, the kind of spatial background, that causes the nucleation of the bubbles. So now our universe has a cause of its beginning to exist, but it certainly isn't God, right? So the idea that we can get from the universe, that from the premises of the Kalam argument we get to the existence of God doesn't look very plausible. You might also think that there are problems with the premises of that argument, and I think there are. I don't think that we can rule out infinite regress. I think infinite regress would be weird, but you can't rule it out. The whatever begins to exist has a cause of its beginning to exist won't be true if the universe begins with a necessary initial state. Right? That will be the beginning, but there won't be any cause for it, because necessary things don't have causes. They don't need them. Right? So so from a naturalistic point of view, it's kind of overdetermined. There's a bunch of different reasons why you'll think that the argument doesn't work.
Yeah, I have issue with the word begins to, because I feel like that's just slipped in there to kind of safeguard God.
Well, you might think that it slipped in there, or you might think, well, actually, it's a feature of the theistic position.
Yeah.
Right? But depending what begins means, it might turn out that God begins to exist. Right? There's some trickiness, as you just said, about beginning, because you might think that God's the first cause, right? So God doesn't have a cause. God doesn't begin to exist. God's a necessary being, right? But in that sense, you can take the same view about the universe. So you could accept the premise that whatever begins to exist has a cause. Of its existence, and just say, but God doesn't.
Yeah.
God doesn't begin to exist. God doesn't have a cause, right? I mean, you can say the same thing about the universe. It doesn't begin to exist. It doesn't have a cause.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. Teleological / design. The universe's order, fine-tuning, and information look more the result of intention than blind. Chance.
Okay, so there's a bunch of these arguments too. For a long time, pretty much up until Darwin, most people thought that the complexity of things like the human eye were just directly evidence for a designer, and the designer would have to be God. I mean, there's a bit of a gap there. But after Darwin, that argument about the human eye, most people think looks kind of pretty weak, because we think that there's an evolutionary story that takes you from very simple photosensitive patch to the fully blown eye without any intervention at any point of anything outside the natural order. There's other design arguments that refer to the so-called fine-tuning of the physical constants in the universe. So there are physical theories which say that there's a range of constants, and if the constants had varied just a little bit, the universe would have been very different. It would either have only lasted for a tiny fraction of a second, or it would have blown apart really rapidly. And in either case, there wouldn't have been, and now you can put in whatever you like, there wouldn't have been life, there wouldn't have been human beings, there wouldn't have been stars, there wouldn't have been beetles, whatever. Now, is that an argument for God? It's, even supposing that it's true, because it's controversial. It certainly looks as though it's true, but we don't have any agreement on the kind of true model of the universe yet. And there's always this possibility that new maths and new modelling will get rid of the constants or explain them somehow or other.
Yeah.
That's possible.
I tend to think of us as, two Greeks sitting there wondering where the thunder's coming from, and one of us is Zeus. That's where I feel like we're at with this, we're discovering things about the universe at the moment that are so far beyond our perception, our understanding, that any kind of rationale that we have for them now doesn't cut it. But that's okay.
So that's one kind of response. A different kind of response is to go back to what I said about the initial state of the universe being necessary. If the constants take particular values in that initial state, then it turns out the values are necessary and they don't need a further explanation. Right? Most people, when I say this, find it not entirely satisfying, because they want a story that explains why the values are exactly as they are, rather than slightly differently, where things would have been very different. But that question doesn't arise if they couldn't have taken a different value.
Yeah.
Right. So.
Or alternatively, if there's multiverses, we could just be in one of the universes that have...
So that's the other way. If it's a multiverse, you can have a random assignment, and most universes just
don't have
are squibs or very explosive, and every now and then you get one that's in the Goldilocks zone, and maybe you get life in some or all of them. Maybe you get stars in some or all of them, whatever it is that you...
But it's also kind of infuriating, that point too, because if the universe is fine-tuned for anything, it's fine-tuned for the creation of black holes. You know what I mean? Which is like,
okay, so,
as a designer, that comes...
So I said beetles because Haldane, the biologist, was asked what lessons he thought he'd learnt about God from his study of biology. And he said, well, the Lord seems to be inordinately fond of beetles because there are thousands and thousands of different species of beetles.
Yeah. That's actually brilliant. That's actually really good. What about moral / axiological? So objective moral values, duties, and human dignity are best grounded in a personal, perfectively good source.
So for various reasons, I think, given the story that I told about what naturalism is, that one good option for naturalists is going to be to think that there's a class of moral truths whose status is much like the status of mathematical truths. They're just necessary, right? And there's no explaining why they're necessary. The kind of fundamental mathematical truths couldn't be otherwise. But it's not like there's something that makes them be that way. They just have to be that way. And so I think it's plausible, for example, that it's just a kind of necessary truth, that it's not okay to kill your infant children. And then there's a little set of brackets, except if it's permissible, which, for example, for the Inuit, when the survival of the entire community was threatened by the addition of the extra infant, they would practice infanticide. But absent special conditions, it's not okay all the time. Just, you know, your neighbours, your friends, they're just not open slathered, right? And I don't think of, I'm inclined to favour a view which just says this, that is either itself a necessary truth or it follows from something that's a necessary truth, a fundamental necessary truth. Naturalists have lots of other options. You can be a subjectivist, you can be a kind of response-dependent theorist, you can be an eliminativist like Mackie and say that there are no moral truths. There's lots of different ways you can go, and naturalists have different temperaments.
Where are you at?
So, well, I'm of the kind of necessary. I think that probably there are necessary truths. You don't need God. You don't need anything to make them necessary. So, as a view, it's not kind of more expensive than the theistic view. And theists face certain difficulties, like with the Euthyphro objection, that suggests that they may be independently committed to the idea that there's a necessity that attaches to moral truths anyway. Right, you know, the question about why God picked to promulgate these particular moral truths that are promulgated in the various scriptures around the world. One thing is that God just made it up, but then they look arbitrary. A different thought is they were true independently of God and God was just reporting them. But if they're true independently of God, theism's not giving you any advantage. Right, so that's kind of roughly where I sit on the questions about morality.
What, do you have an issue with? Well, you would, but what's your issue with my perspective, again, surface level, is that morality might not exist as we think it does, and it's probably just people operating within their preferences. So
right, so that's a view which could be a subjectivist view, or it could be a kind of eliminativist view. Really, there's no such things as obligations and so on. It's just that lots of us living together, trying to manage our preferences, we've evolved this sort of system of this fictional system.
That's what feels
that we
right
use
to
manage it, right? And that's another one of the naturalist positions that's on the table. So, for example, Richard Joyce, who's based somewhere in New Zealand, runs a kind of moral fictionalism of roughly that kind. That's not the way I'm inclined to go, but I think my position really is an outlier on this. I think that naturalists tend more towards things like eliminativism than they do towards the kind of objectivism that I'm quite happy to go with.
Have you written about this?
Not much.
Okay.
And we've strayed out of my real areas of expertise at this point.
That's fine.
So I've said online in various places that that's the way I'm inclined to lean, and I've probably said in some of my writings, like in a paragraph, but that this is the way that I tend to lean. But I don't have enough of a well-developed position to really want to say more than that.
That's okay.